that it's 4 o'clock. Welcome and shalom to everyone who's joined us for the Australia-Israel Scholars Seminars today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Turrbal and Yago people as traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet today. I pay my respects to their ancestors and their descendants. So I'm very excited today to welcome Professor Elisheva Baumgarten, Professor of Jewish History at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Elisheva studies the social and religious history of the Jews of medieval Northern Europe and teaches medieval history at the Department of Jewish History and Contemporary Jewry and in the Department of History at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Her title of her talk today is From Inclusion to Expulsion, the Jews of Medieval Europe. So I'd love to hand over to Elisheva now. Welcome, Elisheva.
Okay, good afternoon, and thank you very much for having me. I think this is a wonderful series, and I'm very honored to be here and to speak to you. I will share my PowerPoint, and then I will start talking a little bit. And just to save the questions, yes, I was born in New York, and that's why I sound like a New Yorker. So that is something people always ask. So I'll say that just at the outset. Okay. So you can see the PowerPoint now, right? In the right mode. 1 second, let us just go to the slide mode. Can you see it?
Yes, perfect. Thanks, Elisheva.
Okay, so I'm a medievalist. I study the Jews of medieval Europe, roughly between 900 to 1500, if you need to put years on it. And I think this period in medieval Europe is very interesting also for its modern parallels, both in the 20th century and even to some extent for different things that are taking place today, for phenomena that take place over time, for cycles that take place over time. I will be talking about the medieval today, but maybe in the Q&A, somebody will want to think about today and about modern issues. I'm going to start with a few maps to orient you so you know where we are. I will say that I'm a specialist on the Jews of Northern Europe or Western and Northern Europe. So mainly the Jews who lived in Germany and Northern France, the area we in kind of Jewish speak today call Ashkenaz. So the Ashkenazi Jews who then at the end of the period I'll be talking about today, so in the 14th century, moved eastward to what today is Poland and Russia, etc. So I'm really talking about the genesis of the Ashkenazi community. And if you look at this map, which is not a great map, but it's enough for you to see, you can see the red and the black. And you can see the two dates I put here, the first evidence around 950 and the first crusade of 1096. So you can see that the Jews came from Spain and Italy, where they had lived since antiquity, really. They started moving upward and westward in medieval Europe, coming to France probably around the year 800 and reaching Germany probably someplace around 900. And they settle along the rivers because the rivers in medieval Europe are the highways. So the best way to get from place to place is by taking a boat and going along the river. And in Germany, or today's Germany, they really settle along the Rhine River, which you can see here. And all the places marked in red are the first settlements. In 1096, we have the First Crusade, when the Christians who are on their way to the Holy Land attack some of these Jewish communities. But the communities managed to revive themselves pretty quickly. And if you look at the black places here, you can see how after the year 1096, more and more settlements are created in which Christians live, of course, but Jews join them. So the first part of my talk today will focus on the Jews who join these towns and settlements. The second part of my talk today will be what happens 300 years later when these Jews are being expelled from these places during the 14th century. And of course, most of my research is someplace in between. But today I really just wanted to show the process. I wanted to say a word about sources because as a historian, I think it's always really important to talk about sources. So here you just see a pictogram I created a few years ago for an application about all the sources that I use. And you can see that some of them are in Hebrew, some of them are in Yiddish, some of them are in German, some of them are in Latin. So we try to use as wide a variety of sources as we can to learn as much as we can about the Jews settling in medieval Europe during this period. So I just showed you a map that showed you red the first places and black the next places. I know you can't read the map, but actually the names of the places aren't that important. I just want you to get an impression of how many places Jews joined in Germany along the Rhine River. So if you look at this map, You can see even more dots. This is the Rhine River again, this black line here. And three of the most important Jewish communities that many people have heard of, Speyer, Worms, and Mainz. I should actually say it in the opposite order, Mainz, Worms, and Speyer. Just we usually use the acronym SHUM, which is why I started with the S, are founded someplace around the year 900 to 1000. And these communities grow and grow and grow. And you can see that around them, many of the different settlements that existed beforehand have Jews joining them. So the only names you see here on the map are places where there are Jews. So if you compare this map to the map I showed you just a moment ago, you can see how many more places there are with Jews in them. This is already the second half of the 13th century. At the end of the second half of the 13th century, a lot of very bad events happened to the Jews of Europe. So in 1290, the Jews are expelled from England, and they don't return until the early modern period. In 1298, the Jews in Germany are attacked in what we call the Rindfleisch events. In the 14th century, there are multiple expulsions from northern France. In 1394, the Jews are finally expelled from France, not to return until the 18th century. And then there are other persecutions until the major persecutions, which I'll talk about at the end of my talk, which is the Black Death in the mid-14th century. So that's a very different picture from many, many settlements where Jews are joining to expulsion. And this is the same area I just showed you a moment ago. And this you can see every dot here that's in color is a pogrom against Jews in the first half of the 14th century. So something changes very radically. And this phenomena of inclusion and then exclusion, or what I called in my title, inclusion and then expulsion, is one that we as scholars really try to explore and understand. Part of my research is not to explore kind of the high-brow writings of churchmen or elitists, but really to look at what life was like on the ground for people, because the ideology doesn't really capture what's going on during this period. Ideology is one thing, but you need people to perform these expulsions or to allow Jews to come in. So what I want to do now, in the time I have left, and I am very appreciative of this format, which is the first format, is show you two documents from when Jews were accepted into a community, and then to show you a few documents that describe their expulsion in the 14th century. We'll see some contrasts and some similarities between them. So the first thing I have to say is that every community in the Middle Ages had to receive a charter. And this is just an example of a medieval charter. I know you can't read it. I can't read it on this screen either, but just to show you what it looked like. It's a certificate. You've all heard of the Magna Carta, which was a great charter in England in the medieval period. But every single institution needs a charter, whether you're a monastery, a university, a guild, a parish church. The ruler of the city or the ruler of the area would give you a charter. So Jews are no exception. They need their privileges in order to be able to be part of whatever place they live in. Now, I said that Jews lived along the Rhineland. They lived in the city of Mainz and Worms before 1084, which is the date I'll be talking about. In 1084, something happened. There was a fire in Mainz, and there was an accusation against the Jews in Worms that they had done something. And at that point, the bishop of Speyer decided to invite the Jews to live in Speyer. And this is what he writes. And he says as follows: whereas I have turned the villa of Speyer into a city. So basically what's happening is all of medieval Europe is going through a process of urbanization. For example, Paris grows from about 20,000 people to 200,000 people from the 10th century to the 13th century. And in Germany, places that I would call villages become towns, and places that I would call towns become bigger towns. It's hard to call them cities because they're not really cities in modern terms. But let's say if a town like this had 10,000 inhabitants, maybe 200 or 500 of them would be Jews. We're talking about very small Jewish communities, usually the communities based on merchants who are invited to join the cities. So here we see him writing about Speyer. I have turned the villa of Speyer into a city. I thought to increase infinitely the honor of our place if I should assemble there Jews as well. So he says it would be good for us to have some Jews here. The assembled Jews I placed outside the commune and the habitation of the other town dwellers, and enclosed them within a wall in order that they should not be easily harassed by the insolence of the worst mob. So we already see that when Jews are being included, there's some tension with them, especially the lower classes in the city are considered those who don't like the Jews. And he, the bishop of Speyer, it's a bishop town, so the head of the town is a bishop, says, I think it would be great if Jews came here, but I know I need to protect them. And he tells us, the place of their dwelling, which I have acquired legally, the slope partly with money and partly in exchange, while the valley I received, etc., I gave them on this condition that they should pay annually £3 and 1.5 in the money of Speyer for the common use of the brothers. So the Jews get this privilege, but they have to pay for it. They have to pay taxes every year to the church. He's a bishop. He belongs to an order. They have to pay them taxes. And he continues, and I also granted them the free right to exchange gold and silver, to buy and to sell anything at their will, inside the circuit of their dwelling, and from the area outside the dock gate and in the dock gate themselves. And I also gave them the same permission throughout the entire city. In other words, they are merchants. We want them because of the business they will bring. And we're giving them permission to trade freely in the city without taxes, without extra tolls, because they will bring business to our city. And he also says that he gave them a burial place, because Jews need a place to bury their dead, their own cemetery. And he also talks a little bit about how they should resolve any disputes they have. I'm not going to read that now because we don't have so much time, but you can see that this privilege lays out the basic terms. We have very similar privileges throughout the Middle Ages for Jews in many communities. It's a form. It's like a form situation in which the different rulers copy from each other and they use the same format in different ways in different places. So what's going on in 1084? The Jews are being invited to join. How do the Jews feel about this? Let's just look at a Jewish document for a minute, translated from Hebrew. The Jews say like this: in the beginning, we came to prop up our tents, whose stakes will never be plucked up, to this city of Speyer. They feel at home. This will be their home. They hope they're settling here forever. And why? This was because of the fire which struck the city of Mainz, because the city of Mainz was our hometown, the place of our ancestors, the most ancient, laudable, commendable community. And the city was burnt. The neighborhood of the Jews was burnt. And therefore they decided to go to Speyer, and they tell us. And he, Bishop Rudiger of Speyer, accepted us with a happy face and sent his lords and knights to follow us into the city. And he gave us the outskirts of the city and told us he would encircle us with a wall, gates, and vaults, etc. So we see that the Jews agree exactly with the story we just read in the Christian charter, and they come to live in the city of Speyer. Now, just to understand what's going on here, this is the synagogue they built. You can see the archaeology that's left today. This is the mikveh, the ritual bath they built that survives almost completely. And this is the cathedral built at almost the same time. So you understand that the city is being built up. And as he said, the best thing is to have the Jews come in. And the Jews are part of it. They build their synagogue from the same stone. They build their ritual bath from the same stone. They're part of this urban renewal. And if we look at a map for a moment of Speyer, you can see here that this is the cathedral. The river actually goes here. You can't see it on my map, but it actually goes here where my mouse is, right along can you see the mouse? Right along the cathedral edge. So you come into the city and you see the cathedral. And what you can see here, very interestingly, is that the Jews live in the center of the city. You see here it says synagogue and mikveh. That's what I just showed you. Very close to the cathedral. This is supposedly where Rudiger wanted them to live, but it seems they never lived there. The Jews in all medieval cities are always very close to the cathedral. They're in the center of trade. Anyone who comes into the city passes by the Jewish quarter. Anybody who comes by water passes by the Jewish quarter. I'm going to stop here, but you understand how the Jews came in. Life is not always simple. There are a lot of tensions. I'll mention one tension, which is the tension between the church and the synagogue, the ecclesia and the synagoga. Here you see the Christian symbol of the synagogue blinded by the truth, because the Jews didn't see the truth, whereas ecclesia stands tall, and you see the veil on the synagogue's eyes, and here you see that the ecclesia is crowned. This is a very, very common statue all over Europe. But the Jews also feel at home. Look at this Hebrew manuscript. This is how they draw their city. This is a typical German city in a Hebrew manuscript, but you can see it doesn't have a church. It only has synagogues and other Jewish buildings. So I'm going to run ahead because, of course, time is running out, but just to show you how much the Jews produce, you can see some beautiful things. And the Jews were very much part of the local culture. What I'm showing you here is from the Erfurt treasure, the treasure found in Erfurt, Germany. It was found, left behind by a Jew who in the 14th century left his stuff behind, not knowing he would never return. And now we're getting to the time of expulsion. So tensions are rising. The 13th century is a century of plenty in medieval Europe. But at the end of the 13th century, there are tremendous economic problems, tremendous political problems, and tremendous ecological problems. The beginning of the 14th century is a century of hunger, of famine, of drought. And of course, this all plays out in economic and political terms. The Jews still live very well. You can see that this man in Erfurt had a lot of wealth in his house. You can see how rich he was. I just have to show you this because it's so beautiful. But if you look at what I circled on the previous slide, these are two beautiful cups that he had. They're called double cups. And if you look here, you can see that they're very much a part of their surroundings. These are Aesop's fables drawn on the bottom of those double cups. So not something specifically Jewish. Jews had plenty of different objects that were just from the beautiful culture of people around them. And rich Jews had that, of course, as well. So those are the cups we just saw a second ago. But what happened that this Jew had to run away and leave his things behind? So tensions are growing in medieval Europe. And the political tensions aren't just between Jews and Christians, they're between Jews and many other people. The plague comes from the East. If I was talking now in 2020, I would be comparing this to the COVID plague that we knew in different ways. But now we're already in 2024 with troubles of our own and of a different sort, or other troubles of different sort, also worldwide troubles. But you can see how the plague comes in. You can see the green is over here and it kind of moves across. And as the plague is coming into Europe, this is probably the first event we can talk about in which news of the event is reaching places before the event itself. So news of this plague is coming to different places in medieval Europe. The plague is coming, the plague is coming. Usually, when we think of the Black Death and of the Jews, and we imagine the Jews being accused of poisoning wells and all kinds of other accusations that popped up, usually we know of two things. One, we know that people say that Jews didn't die because they kept kosher, because they didn't eat certain food. That's a myth. When the Jews were in places that the plague struck, they died just like their neighbors. We'll see that in a moment. But the other thing we usually don't realize is that the Jews were usually expelled before the plague arrived. So when rumors of the plague came, communities decided to expel their Jews, blaming them for spreading diseases, for being bad, for poisoning people, for trying to do other bad things to them. But these are political and economic tensions. They're not because something is happening medically. It often happens 3 or 4 months before the plague actually arrives in these places that the Jews are either expelled or in some cases, they're actually burned. So what you can see here is Jews burned at stake in Strasbourg a few months before the plague arrived in Strasbourg. That was one thing that happened to Jews. If we look at this description, and this is a description written in the later 14th century afterwards, it's based on a book written around 1380 or a little bit before 1380, and they tell about the plague that reached Spain. And they say like this. This man, Chaim Gali Papa, says like this: and there was a cry from one end of the earth to another, like none ever before. And from a city of 1,100 remained, and from a city of 100, 10 remained in those times. And for each person who fell sick or died from the Jews, 100 non-Jews died. And they became consumed with zealousness, and one couldn't speak to them peacefully. This is the case in Iberia. Usually the Jews were still there. They weren't expelled before the plague arrived. We have many tombstones from Iberia that tell us that many Jews were killed as well. But of course, if you have a city of 10,000 with 100 or 200 Jews, for every Jew that dies, 100 non-Jews die, because that's the ratio of people in the city. But in further north, in France and in Germany, the Jews were greeted with much more violence even before it came, even before the plague arrived. And here you can see from something written by a French doctor. In some places, people believed that the Jews poisoned the world and therefore killed them. In others, handicapped paupers were accused and driven away. In others, nobles, and thus they had to travel through the land. Eventually, it came to pass that guards were posted in cities and villages and did not allow anyone to enter unless they knew him well. And they found anyone with powders or ointments, and they made him swallow them, since they feared they may be potion. Now that's interesting from a medical point of view, how they thought poison spread. But what I think is really interesting in this source is that the Jews are accused of poisoning the world before the plague comes, but not just them. Also handicapped people, also paupers, also certain nobles. So we can see here persecution against anybody who wasn't part of kind of the main body of the different places that people lived in. And Jews were the most extreme case of that. And we see this in a number of different descriptions. In some of them, the people who write the descriptions believe the Jews have poisoned the world, and in other, they're angry that the Jews are being accused of poisoning the world. And I would say that in the end, in some of the places, in many of the places, the Jews are expelled or burned, like we saw in that picture. And in some places, they're allowed to remain. In many of the places, the Jews remain 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 or 70 years later. They're readmitted and often re-expelled. And the late 14th and early 15th century are a period of inclusion and expulsion, readmittance and expulsion. In Germany, the Jews remain until modern times, being expelled and re-included. And in other places, like I said before, like France and England, and we all know about Spain, the Jews are expelled and they don't return until modern times. So I have to end now. I'm just going to end by saying that the Jews felt very much at home in medieval Europe in the period between their invitation and then this expulsion. You can see this here in this manuscript that's both in Hebrew. It also looks very European, very medieval. And part of what my research is about right now, and that's my new research project that I'm running now, is we call it Contending with Crises, the Jews of 14th century Europe. And we're really trying to understand this century of expulsion and persecution better. We started this project 2 years ago. I can't say it's because of current events. We started it really when we were thinking about COVID, but the idea behind it is to give Jewish people a voice during this period and not just say, oh, they were victims, but to understand how they contended with the crisis they were faced with. So I'll stop my PowerPoint now, and I'm glad to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elisheva. That was extremely fascinating talk. And I'll invite all of the audience to type your questions into the chat, or if you'd like to ask your question in person, please raise your hand and I'll invite you to go off mute in time. So Elisheva, I have a question to start. So it was a period of constant expulsion and then readmittance and then expulsion again. Was it tied to different events, like the Black Death was the big one, but other moments in time or other events that then led to the persecution?
I mean, in some cases, they're the big expulsion and then they're the smaller expulsion. So we have a lot of little events that happen during the period, and they're often tied to very specific events in the city. Somebody's accused of doing this, or during this period, we have a lot of ritual murder accusations from the 13th century and onwards that Jews are accused of killing a boy, a Christian boy, or of trying to convert a Christian boy and then killing him. There are also a lot of host desecrations, accusing Jews of stealing the host from the Mass and stabbing it or urinating on it or doing other terrible things to it. Now, I have to say that there was a tremendous amount of trade in hosts. The host from the Mass was considered very miraculous. So a lot of healers would steal the host and try to use it for their magic. And a lot of robbers would steal the host and try to use it to protect them when they were breaking into homes. And the host was traded in a lot of different ways. It doesn't just have to do with Jews. I think one of the things I would say is most of what we're talking about doesn't just have to do with Jews. In other words, any phenomena Jews are involved in, there are other people involved with as well. One of the things I often tell my students when I ask them a question, I always say, it's not all about the Jews, right? There are lots of different processes going on in medieval Europe, and some of them are being kind of tacked onto the Jews or blamed on the Jews. But if there's economic unrest or political tensions, the Jews are sometimes kind of the scapegoats. but it's not because they're so centrally involved, right? And I think we can see a lot of modern examples that echo that, and everybody can understand what I'm talking about. I think Weimar Germany is a good example of that as well, that anti-Semitism causes the Jews, who were less than 1% of the German population, to be blamed for huge processes that are going on in Germany that you can't blame 1% of the population for when such huge economic and political upheavals are happening. So the same thing is happening in medieval Europe. The question is how the Jews came to be in that situation. Now, of course, something like the plague is a big deal, but if it's happening 4 months before the plague comes, it's also in some ways just an excuse. So I'll just answer this question in one final sentence, which is to say that scholars really have a push and pull between them, how local we have to be and how global we have to be. Because some scholars will say, no, we have to go into this specific place and understand the circumstances on the ground in that place. And others will say, but it's happening in one place and then another place and another place and another place. So how can we say it has to do with local circumstances? It has to do with a more general sentiment. I personally think both are right, right? So in local places, there's specific events tacked onto. And in other places, they hear what's going on in one place and it kind of infects them. We had a conference this past year, about expulsions, including talks on expulsions that never happened. So it's also interesting to see where it doesn't happen and where the Jews remain. So we have a lot of things to balance that.
Wow, that's really fascinating. And seems that storytelling is a powerful factor in all of this. We have quite a few questions now, so I'll try to get through
Okay,
them.
so I'll try to answer them. Should I look at them?
Yeah, I can read them out. So we have one from
Yeah.
Yoni, which is, what did expulsion look like once a community leaves? Where did the communities go? Did they go all together? Did they separate? Did they build their own settlements?
So actually, we don't have enough information about that. One of my students who works on the expulsions from France is now trying to follow different people wherever they went to. It seems that they do go as a community, because we have them coming to places and saying, we the French, we think this, we think that. How are you the people in Provence? Northern France and southern France were separate during that period. How do you the people in Provence tell us, we Parisians, we have our own way of doing things. So we have some community, I'd say, tips that show us that they go as a community, but they also really disperse. In Germany, something really interesting happens, which is that a lot of the more affluent families, and of course we know more about affluent people because they leave more records. The rich people always have more ways to leave their mark. That's just the way the world works. Some of them start sending their kids to different places. So they'll have a kid in Italy, and Italy isn't exiled the way that Germany or France are exiled, or England, and they'll send a kid to Poland, and they'll send a kid to what becomes Russia, etc. So you'll have them have outposts, and there are people who've done really interesting work in the 16th and 17th century showing how they have like somebody at every port, and that helps create a business network afterwards. But this is really a question we have to ask, and I would say that the reason we need to ask it is because so many scholars have treated the 14th century like a Holocaust, and I don't think the comparison is the right comparison. And therefore, they've turned the Jews into victims. And therefore, they've looked very little at what the Jews produced culturally and how they lived their lives. And that's really something I think we need to do, looking at the Jews from Northern Europe and how they move.
Wow, that's really interesting. We have another question from Viva Harmer. Where did the idea of expulsion come from? Burning seems more logical, getting rid of the vermin, but expulsion doesn't seem so self-evident. Is there a precedent?
Oh, that's really interesting. I would say that expulsion it's a really interesting question, especially the way she just worded it for me as a medievalist. So I think that's great that I can have this question, because expulsion is a classic medieval punishment. People are expelled in the medieval world all the time. If you commit a terrible crime, or you're accused of a terrible rape or something like that, you can be expelled from your town, even just 4 kilometers from your town, for a month, for 2 months, for 6 years, for 20 years, for whatever it is. If you murder somebody, you can be expelled. So expulsion is a classic medieval punishment, which is why it makes sense. Now, killing and burning, of course, the medieval world is very, very violent, but it depends what you think you're accomplishing by expelling and what the political circumstances are. So if you're accusing someone of spreading poison, maybe killing makes more sense. But if you're accusing somebody of being on the wrong side of the political alignment, expelling makes more sense. And what I didn't say in answer to Yanni's question that I'll add is that in a lot of places, Jews come back a year or 2 years or 3 years later. what really interests me most, I have a whole group of students, so some of them have other interests. What really interests me most is what happens when they come back. And this really interested me because of COVID. That's how I got really interested in this question, because people kept on saying during COVID that cities would never be the same. And I kept on thinking, that's not true. Cities will come back to what they were. And the reason I thought that is because when Jews come back to their towns, they do everything the same as they did before they left. They buy the same houses, they live in the same places, they take care of the same things, and the big changes happen 50 or 100 years later. I think we're in a much faster world, so our big changes might happen in 10 or 15 years and not 50 or 100 years. But I think that people like to go back to what they knew. And that's why the easiest default is always going back to what you knew. And these communities invite the Jews back, just like they had before. I know we have to finish soon, so you tell me, Joe, how many more minutes
We
we have.
have two more questions, so we can continue for another few minutes, 5 minutes. Osnat asks, members of these Jewish communities were also known for their knowledge of medicine. So I'm curious about the potion version.
So I think it works both ways, Osnat. I think it's a good question. Jews were not allowed, for example, to go to university and study medicine, and medicine becomes more and more licensed throughout the Middle Ages. You have to get a medical license. But Jews were known as doctors, as physicians, especially in the South, so in Spain or in Italy, but also up north. In France and Germany, we have knowledge of Jewish doctors, but that actually makes the potions all the more suspicious. Because if you're going to accuse Jews of poisoning, they actually have that knowledge because they're also known as making medicine. So it works both ways. On the one hand, you might go to them when you're sick, but if they don't succeed or you die, you might blame them even more. And if you think there's a poison spreading, they are also kind of natural suspects. So I hope that answers that.
And we have a final question from Ron, which is when the expulsions readmissions occur, are they placed back in the same places, in the same towns, or is there something like a generational knowledge where they would get back into the country but not to the same town?
So I started just to answer that and what I said, and it really depends where. At one point I'll just make, because I think it's important, is that during the Middle Ages there are no ghettos. So the Jews live in what they call a Jewish neighborhood. If I was doing a longer talk, I would show you how we can tell from house registers that there are Jews living alongside Christians in those neighborhoods. After the Jews are readmitted, they're often readmitted to like a Jewish block where there might have been Christian neighbors, but it's much more secluded, and it's usually a small part of where they lived before. So for example, in Paris, the Jews were expelled in 1306. When they're readmitted in the 1360s, they're given a very small part of the area they used to live in. And that's where they live with Christian neighbors, but still that's the Jewish street, and there's like a gate going into that street that can be locked and unlocked. So we can see the Jews living in more constricted areas, and also they become much more rural. So some towns won't let the Jews come live in them, but they'll let them trade in them. So I'll just end with this example, Strasbourg. I showed you the picture of the expulsion from Strasbourg, but the Jews do come back, at least for some time. And when they're expelled finally from Strasbourg, they live in the little villages around Strasbourg. They come into Strasbourg every day and trade. And then at 10 o'clock at night, they have to leave. And until the 20th century, I think until the 70s, I don't remember the date, but definitely in the 60s, because my parents lived in Strasbourg in the 60s, and they've told me about this. At 10 o'clock at night, the cathedral bell rang. That was the sign that any Jew in the city had to leave during the 15th and 16th century. So they could come in, do their business, but when the bell rang, they had to be outside the walls and go back to their villages. So that was kind of a way of, having your cake and eating it too. So you had Jews doing trade in the city, but you also didn't have them in the city in a way that you felt endangered you if you were a Christian who was scared of Jews. So I hope that answers the question.
Wow, and that's a really fascinating story. So why don't they still ring the bell in the 60s? Like just historical artifact?
I mean, it was the cathedral tradition to ring the bell. I mean, the bell rings, of course, every time of day, right? But at any cathedral or any city has a bell. That's also a cathedral. You have a very beautiful sculpture of the synagogue and ecclesia that I showed you during my presentation, and you can see that till today. But that was just part of the city way of doing things, and it took a real decision to decide to stop ringing that bell, especially with the symbolism and after the Holocaust and everything that it stood for.
Wow, that's amazing. Wow, look, very thought-provoking talk. Thank you so much, Elisheva, for your talk today. It was fascinating. And we hope to see our participants at future talks in this series. And please, everyone, feel free to reach out to Elisheva if you have any research questions or for collaborations. She's easy to find on the Hebrew University of Jerusalem's website. And thank you again, Elisheva, for your really thought-provoking talk. And we'll share it on Zoom, if that's okay with you. Not Zoom, on YouTube, if that's all right with you.
That is fine. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Toda rabah, and hope to see you all soon. Thank you.
Hope to see us all in better times. Bye-bye.
Yes.